My friends, it's been said that Americans are faced with a choice between the stupid party and the evil party. And that once in a while, the two parties get together and they do something that's both stupid and evil. And this is called bipartisanship. If anything, though, that's too optimistic, because in so many ways that matter, we may as well have a one-party system. Some people on the left are finally discovering, to their chagrin, that the so-called change Barack Obama would make to foreign policy is just cosmetic. And what did they expect? Look at his foreign policy panel. Look who's on it. Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, and liberals and leftists, listen up. This woman, when she was on 60 Minutes, and she was asked, what about the 500,000 children that the sanctions on Iraq have killed? She said, we believe the price has been worth it. So that's the change candidate. Well, how very refreshing. Since the Fed was established in 1913, the dollar has lost 95% of its value. The Federal Reserve System has given us more financial bubbles than we can count. When it inflates the money supply, it lowers the value of the dollars in Americans' pockets and hurts society's most vulnerable. It redistributes wealth from the middle class and the poor to the politically well-connected by means of what economists call distribution or Cantillon effects. F.A. Hayek won the Nobel Prize in economics for showing how central banks, like the Fed, create the boom-bust cycle in our economy. Because when the central bank manipulates interest rates, it causes massive discoordination. The interest rate is supposed to coordinate production across time, but it can do so only if it reflects an aggregate of voluntary choices, not the whim of the Fed chairman. Entrepreneurs are misled by the Fed into making investments that make no sense in light of current resource availability, and the Fed's intervention creates a boom that leads inevitably to a bust. Well, thankfully, more and more financial analysts are coming to recognize what's called the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Now wait. This is an educated crowd. I say the Austrian theory of the business cycle, you know it. Let's go ask John McCain what he knows about Hayek's theory. We may as well be speaking Chinese. In the 1920s, when so-called mainstream economists were foolishly assuring us that permanent prosperity had arrived, it was the so-called Austrian school of economic thought, of which Ron Paul is a member, that predicted the Great Depression alone. And yet, in spite of all this, we've had no serious discussion of the Federal Reserve System in our political life for nearly 100 years. It has been fantastically successful in depoliticizing itself. No politician ever mentions it. And although he is too genuinely humble to acknowledge it, one man is responsible for finally blasting open this forbidden question: Ron Paul. Look at how members of Congress treat the Fed chairman when he appears before them. He gets asked only the most inane, sycophantic questions. Members of the Banking Committee, decked out in their I Heart Bernanke t-shirts, are waving incense in front of him. Ron Paul, on the other hand, looks him in the eye and says, "You are stealing from the poor." Or let's suppose you're concerned about war and what Ron Paul calls our bull in a china shop foreign policy. And by the way, that's a concern that's shared by the genuine left, people like Kirkpatrick Sale and Gore Vidal, and the genuine right, people like Russell Kirk, traditional conservatives like Robert Taft as well, not today's neoconservative death cult. But if you're concerned about war, you should care about the Fed. Because the Fed, the central bank, is the lifeblood of the empire. If you want to stop the war machine, you have to go after the money machine. Public stands up. Folks, how did Lyndon Johnson get away with his war spending in Vietnam? By a deliberate policy of concealing the cost through inflation, a cost the American people bore only later in the stagflation of the 1970s. Just the cost overruns on 2 Pentagon projects added up to more than the combined GDPs of North and South Vietnam. By silently looting the American population, the government was able to get away with much more spending than would otherwise have been possible. And then we have this war, disastrous war in Iraq, the propaganda for which was fed to us by America's Pravda, the New York Times. Now, how has that war been funded? By borrowing from foreigners and creating new money out of thin air.